Hello, I'm Kevin Berger, author of Atheism is Untenable, Objecting to the Absence of Belief, Bogus, the Intellectual Dishonesty of Non-Belief, and Debating Dilettante, Transgenderism and the Unfalsifiability of Identity. Apologetics is a system of arguments in defense of something. That's not what I do here. As someone who is explicitly irreligious and agnostic, I have no need for apologetics and cannot logically shift the burden of proof for an irrelevant claim that I never made in the first place. If you imply otherwise or demand that I prove my God, you will have exposed your own dishonesty and lose any credibility. No, I apply skepticism and polemics to the claims that atheists make, chiefly among them the assertion to not make any claims, which is self-defeating. This is Justified Nonetheless. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. A couple of weeks ago, I uploaded a video where, during the Q&A of the debate, I asked Craig McNeill a single question and made a single statement regarding secular humanism, prompting Craig to respond with two proven lies, which I soundly refuted in said video. I'll be linking that video to this one for convenience. I tagged McNeill both here on YouTube and on Twitter, which I will do again, and he responded, "You missed the point of everything I said. This video was an embarrassing mess." And I replied to his comment saying, "Yes, you should be embarrassed for blatantly lying. Unlike you, I provide citations, you deluded liar," before providing my list of roughly a dozen citations from that video for good measure. Now, to be fair, I had not watched the entirety of the debate at that time. I caught the tail end of it leading into the Q&A and kept asking what they were discussing, which I will get to in just a moment, had to do with the topic of the debate, which was morality. So I was somewhat surprised when someone, hello Planescrafter, commented saying that McNeill hadn't been arguing for secular humanism specifically this time around, and he had actually created his own ethical system. Since Planescrafter brought this to my attention, I felt it was only fair that I take her observation into consideration and re-review McNeill's contribution. And that brings us to this specific video. Before we dig into all the many things that Craig McNeill is wrong about, I have two things that I need to make clear. First, he is absolutely, irrefutably right about one thing. The United States of America was not founded as a Christian nation. It wasn't established by exclusively Christian founders, and it wasn't founded on exclusively Christian principles. I have a rather lengthy article available on my Patron, link in the description, on this, but I'll point out just a few items right now. The Treaty of Tripoli states bluntly, the government of the United States of America is not, in any sense, founded on the Christian religion. That's unambiguously denying the claim. The treaty was signed by President John Adams, who also signed the Declaration of Independence in 1796, ratified in 1797, unanimously and without debate or discussion by 23 of the 32 seated members of the United States Senate, which included, among others, Richard Stockton, who signed the Declaration of Independence, as well as William Blount and Robert Langdon, both of whom signed the United States Constitution. Blount and Langdon were also both delegates to the Constitutional Congress, as was Senator Alexander Martin. Thomas Jefferson, the third President of the United States and primary author of the Declaration of Independence, wrote, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, and the legitimate powers of government reach actions only, and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no laws respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." And Jefferson's immediate successor to the presidency and the principal author of the Constitution, James Madison, was of the same mindset, stating, "Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion to all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion to all other sect? That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever." Jefferson's mentality was shared by his immediate predecessor as well. John Adams wrote, "Nothing is more dreaded than the national government meddling with religion." There is reason to doubt that Adams, Madison, or Washington was a Christian. Jefferson famously created his own Bible because he denied miracles and the divinity of Jesus of Nazareth. Franklin was a self-identifying deist, as was Paine. Of the 7 individuals typically considered our founding fathers, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington, only Hamilton and Jay seem to meet the criteria of being practicing Christians who actually believed in Christ's divinity and had accepted him as their personal Lord and Savior. Just because someone believes in some higher power doesn't automatically make them Christian. And for evidence of that, I point to Franklin, Jefferson, and Paine. It also bears mentioning that nowhere in the entirety of the United States Constitution or any of its amendments will you find a single mention of God, let alone Jesus Christ. And the principles on which our nation was founded, truth, justice, life, liberty, happiness, equality, none of these is exclusive to Christianity. Now that we have that out of the way, let me be clear again, and this should be obvious by now, this is not a defense of Christianity or any variation of divine command theory. As such, not a single word will be said in defense of Christianity. I won't challenge the legitimacy of his criticisms in terms of either validity or soundness, point out speculation, straw men, questionable interpretations, or other fallacious reasoning. I will, for the sake of this argument, grant the entirety of his criticisms. I will also, for the sake of argument, pretend that none of the Bible's prohibitions against murder, theft, adultery, or kidnapping, or in treatments for passion, charity, and forgiveness exist. I will operate on the presumption that the Bible is pure evil in written format.
Thank you very much. Craig, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, James. Yes, and I am very excited about coming back to DebateCon. Right, tonight my opponent has an unfortunate task of proving that Christian ethics are the best. And before he even gets started, I want to make something very clear. He's going to have to define best a lot, because when you claim your system is the best, that means that nothing else is better. Not utilitarianism, not humanism, not even the ethics of the Federation from Star Trek, where they eliminated scarcity and created a utopia without war, hunger, or poverty. If I can point to anything, literally anything, that does even one thing better than Christianity, then my opponent's claim completely collapses. So let's have a little look for cracks in the armor.
Ah, yes. The old, if I find one thing better, Christianity collapses trick. I've seen this one before, Craig. You act like ethics is a talent show. Find one contestant who sings better, and the rest of the competition gets canceled. But here's the problem. Best doesn't necessarily mean flawless in every single category. A car with better gas mileage isn't automatically a better overall vehicle if the engine explodes as soon as you drive off the lot. That's still a lemon. A surgeon with perfect bedside manner isn't better if his patients keep mysteriously dying. That's still malpractice. So no, Craig, you don't topple an entire moral framework by pointing to some hypothetical utopia and saying, look, no hunger. Because if that system also greenlights slavery, genocide, or whatever moral nightmare sneaks through the back door, congratulations. You just traded one set of problems for something far worse. This isn't Yelp, Craig. It's ethics. And if your better system poisons the cake, it doesn't matter how nice the frosting looks.
Armor. Slavery. Well, Christianity regulates it, never really condemns it. Exodus, Leviticus, Paul, all fine with it. Alternative? Well, humanism. Slavery is maximum suffering. And if your ethics allow owning people, they're not the best. They're broken. And, there is lots of historical records of slavery being based on what the Bible said.
Craig wants to hold up humanism as a shiny new model. No slavery, no suffering, morally superior in every way. But let's slow down and take a look under the hood before we buy this thing. First, yes, as I pointed out in the previous video, humanism is just as vulnerable to slavery as Christianity. Humanism didn't arrive on the scene with some magical moral compass. Problem one, while humanism as we know it didn't even exist while slavery dominated the globe, its principles of reason, autonomy, human welfare were certainly already floating around during the Enlightenment. And guess what? Slavery flourished right along beside them. Problem two, modern humanism still has no explicit prohibition against slavery or any other objective measurement for anything, for calling slavery wrong or genocide or whatever. If well-being defines morality, then what happens when a society decides forced labor for a few improves well-being for the many? Humanism can't appeal to anything higher than majority opinion or shifting sentiment. Therefore, it's perfectly fine for the Eloi to enslave the Morlocks as long as there are more of the former than the latter. So yes, Christianity regulated slavery, but humanism can rationalize, justify, condone, endorse, and even oblige it, as long as the calculus supports it. Problem 3. Humanism collapses when principles collide. Autonomy versus equality. Liberty versus security. Humanism has no internal hierarchy for resolving moral deadlocks. It just votes and hopes for the best. And humanism is inferior in at least 3 other ways. 1. No moral foundation. Humanism grounds morality in human dignity and well-being, but those are just undefined abstractions. Why is an act wrong? If well-being gets reinterpreted to justify it. Humanism can't answer without smuggling in some moral assumption that it can't defend. 2. Majority rules ethics. If the collective decides an act is good for the economy or for progress or whatever, humanism has no objective principle to stop it. It collapses into moral populism. It's democratized morality. Whoop-de-doo! Number 3. Consequentialist blind spots. Humanism embraces outcomes over absolutes. Yes, that provides flexibility, but that degree of flexibility is a double-edged sword that can be exploited.
Women's rights. Women told to shut up, submit, and never lead. What's an alternative to that? Well, virtue ethics. Justice and wisdom apply equally to everyone. Best ethics don't put half the population in permanent timeout.
Craig thinks virtue ethics solves women's rights because justice and wisdom supposedly apply equally to everyone. But let's break this down before we start handing out participation trophies. First, virtue ethics is just as vulnerable to Christianity on this issue. Aristotle, the father of virtue ethics, explicitly argued that women were less rational than men and naturally suited to obedience. The entire ancient Greek virtue tradition, patriarchal from top to bottom. So if Christianity gets roasted for permanent timeouts, virtue ethics built the penalty box. Second, virtue ethics is inferior in at least 3 other ways. First, no mechanism for reform. Virtue ethics defines morality by what a flourishing society looks like. If that society thinks that women belong at home, virtue ethics baptizes the Baptist as the good life. Secondly, subjective virtueless. What counts as courage or wisdom changes from culture to culture. Ancient Sparta thought virtue was tossing babies off of cliffs if they were weak. Modern ethics calls that murder. Virtue ethics just shrugs. Third, no protection for minority. A virtuous majority can easily suppress minority voices, including women, all the while claiming it's for the common good. So no, Craig, pointing at Aristotle while ignoring his views on women is like citing Gordon Ramsay while eating gas station sushi. It's not the moral flex that you think it is.
No. LGBTQ plus rights, Christianity still calls it sinful. The alternative? Well, utilitarian ethics, because love increases happiness and harms nobody. So if your system says that love is wrong, then your system is wrong and not the best.
Craig holds up utilitarianism like it's the rainbow-colored fix to Christian ethics. Love increases happiness, harms nobody, so any system calling it wrong must be wrong itself. Sounds simple, right? Too simple. First, utilitarianism is just as vulnerable as Christianity here. Why? Because the same moral math that celebrates LGBTQIA plus relationships today could condemn them tomorrow if the greater happiness calculus ever flips. If society decides suppressing LGBTQIA plus rights produces more overall well-being by numbers alone, utilitarianism has no principle to stop it. Second, it's inferior in at least 3 other ways. 1. Tyranny of the majority. Utilitarianism sacrifices minorities whenever the majority's happiness demands it. LGBTQIA plus rights only survive if they happen to align with the majority's pleasure index. That's not ethics, that's moral gambling. 2. No intrinsic rights. Under utilitarianism, nobody has any inherent dignity or protections. Only whatever the spreadsheet of pleasure versus pain says this week. That means rights exist on loan, not by principle. 3. The ends justify the means. Utilitarianism can justify forced medical experiments, censorship, or eugenics if they maximize happiness overall. The same logic that says love is good could say your group goes under the bus whenever the numbers change. So, Craig, no, utilitarianism doesn't give LGBTQIA plus rights to people. It hands them out with a lease agreement, and the terms expire whenever the math says so.
Obedience as morality, whatever God says is good. Even genocide or child sacrifice? Well, yeah, great. The alternative? Well, Kantian ethics. Morality is rational, not obedience training. And if God said kick puppies, then Christian ethics says it's moral. That's not ethics, that's puppy abuse. Violence in God's name, the Crusades, Inquisitions, witch hunts. What alternative to that? Well, Buddhist compassion ethics. The best ethics shouldn't need a body count to prove their point.
Craig wants to swap out Christian ethics for Kant and Buddha like they're some kind of moral dream team. But let's check the record before we hand over the trophy. First, Kantian ethics. Craig says it beats Christianity because morality should be rational, not obedience training. The problem is Kant himself defended strict duties that justified some horrifying outcomes, like never lying, even to save a life. Hide a family from the Gestapo? Too bad. Tell the truth, let them die, because rational duty demands it. So, Craig, if Christian ethics risks blind obedience to God, Kantian ethics risks blind obedience to logic, even when it gets people killed. And Buddhist compassion ethics? Craig, Buddhist kingdoms had wars, execution, and forced labor too. Ashoka the Great, often called the model Buddhist ruler, carved moral ethics in stone, right after he slaughtered over 100,000 people in the Kalinga War. Second, both systems are inferior in at least three ways. Moral paralysis. Kantian duty ignores consequences. Buddhist compassion often ignores justice. Both risk letting atrocity slide in the name of principle or peace. 2. Internal contradictions. Kant says always treat people as an ends, never the means. Yet his logic justifies letting innocents die for the sake of rules. Buddhists preach non-violence, yet historically build armies and empires. 3. No mechanism for moral triage. When principles collide, duty versus compassion, justice versus peace, neither framework offers a clear way to decide. Christian ethics may have obedience problems, but Kant and Buddha can't even break a tie. So, Craig, swapping God's commandments for Kant's rationalism or Buddhist compassion just trades one set of moral disasters for another. Different frosting, same poisoned cake.
Medical ethics opposed vaccines, anesthesia, contraception, abortion. Brilliant job, Christianity. What's the alternative to that? Well, evidence-based ethics. Reduce harm, save lives. So if your ethics says no to penicillin, they're not the best, they're deadly.
Craig says Christianity opposed vaccines, anesthesia, contraception, and abortion. So let's just swap it out for evidence-based ethics and call it a day. Science saves lives, so problem solved, right? Not so fast. First, evidence-based ethics is just as vulnerable to Christianity on medical ethics because evidence alone doesn't tell you what you ought to do. It tells you what is, not what should be. The Tuskegee experiments, that's evidence gathering. Nazi doctors at Dachau, meticulous note takers. Data doesn't come prepackaged with morality. Second, it's inferior in at least three other ways. 1. Ethics on delay. Evidence always arrives after the harm's been done. By the time you have the data on eugenics or forced sterilization, you've already buried the victims. 2. Majority abuse risk. Evidence-based policies can justify atrocities if the science of the day says it works, like forced lobotomies or scientific racism. 3. There's no ultimate goal. Evidence tells you what happens when you act, but not why any outcome is worth pursuing in the first place. Without a moral framework, all you have is a user's manual for reality, not an ethics system. So yes, Christianity opposed some medical advances, but evidence-based ethics, Craig, that's just a compass with no north. Accurate data, zero direction.
Eternal punishment, infinite hell for finite mistakes. The alternative, restorative justice, proportionality and rehabilitation. Burn forever for eating shellfish. That's not justice, that's cosmic overreaction and pettiness.
Craig says Christianity gives us infinite punishment for finite mistakes, hell for just eating shrimp, and he wants to swap that out for restorative justice, proportionality, and rehabilitation. That sounds nice until you think about what that actually means when you run justice systems on those principles alone. First, restorative justice is just as vulnerable on proportionality as Christianity, because in practice it's often abandoned entirely. Modern restorative models have given licenses to violent offenders in the name of healing communities. Justice gets traded for group therapy while victims watch their attackers walk free. Second, it's inferior for at least 3 other ways. 1, there's no moral floor. Restorative justice only works if everyone is in agreement on the baseline wrongness of crimes. In societies where theft or assault barely raise an eyebrow, restoration becomes a slap on the wrist. 2, repeat offense risk. Rehabilitation sounds noble until the 3rd time the restored criminal victimizes someone else. Christian hell might be eternal, but at least it guarantees no repeat offenders. 3, cultural subjectivity. What counts as restoration depends entirely on local norms. One culture calls it justice, another calls it appeasement, a third calls it revenge. There's no universal principle holding it all together. So yes, hell may look like cosmic overkill, but restorative justice often turns into cosmic underreaction. Justice on training wheels, coasting downhill with no brakes. Whee!
Golden Rule, claimed as unique, but Confucius, Buddha, and Stoics had it first. Alternative, universal ethics. Christianity borrowed the Golden Rule, then claimed copyright. That's not best, that's plagiarism.
Craig says Christianity ripped off the Golden Rule from Confucius, the Buddha, and Stoics, called it unique, then slapped it on a copyright claim. He wants to replace it with universal ethics, as if stitching together every ancient proverb somehow gives you the ultimate moral system. First, universal ethics is just as vulnerable as Christianity here, because every culture that preached do unto others also made exceptions big enough to drive an ox cart through. Confucius ethics coexisted with rigid class hierarchies. Stoics preached equality while owning slaves. Buddhists taught compassion while running empires and wars. So, universal ethics is universally failed at being universal. Second, it's inferior in at least 3 other ways. Moral vagueness. Do unto others sounds profound until you ask which others count. Women? Foreigners? Heretics? Members of the LGBTQIA community? Who knows? Every culture answers differently. Contradictory applications. Treat others how you want to be treated? Great. Masochists now have a loophole for legalized assault. No enforcement mechanism. Ancient sages gave the world advice, not ethics. When someone broke the Golden Rule, there was no system to stop them beyond try harder next time. So yes, Christianity appropriated the Golden Rule, but universal ethics, it appropriated everything, contradicted itself constantly, and left everyone to sort out the mess.
Child punishment. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Alternative? Well, psychology and positive reinforcement. Best ethics don't involve hitting toddlers with sticks.
Craig says Christianity gave us spare the rod, spoil the child. So let's toss it out for psychology and positive reinforcement, because apparently B.F. Skinner was the Messiah we were all waiting for. First, psychology is just as vulnerable on child punishment as Christianity. For most of the 20th century, mainstream psychology, including people like Watson and even early Skinnerians, endorsed cold, regimented child-rearing practices that would today be labeled as abusive. The science of the time treated kids like lab rats, not like little angels. Second, it's inferior in at least 3 other ways. 1. Shifting consensus. Psychological best practices flip every few decades, often paradoxically at the behest of professionals who do not have children of their own. Spanking was fine until it wasn't. Attachment parenting was fringe until it wasn't. If ethics changes with every new study, then morality becomes a moving target. 2. Instrumental view of humans. Pure behavioral psychology reduces children to stimulus response machines. It risks turning parenting into training, not moral guidance. 3. Neglect of virtue. Focusing on external behavior misses the formation of character. A perfectly behaved child isn't necessarily a moral one, just a well-conditioned one. So yes, the Bible's rod sounds harsh, but psychology, it handed kids from the frying pan straight into the Skinner box.
Animal cruelty. The Bible gives humans dominion, ignores animal suffering. What's the alternative to that? Utilitarianism. Pain matters, no matter the species. Apparently, the best ethics forgot every creature that isn't human.
Craig says Christianity gave humans dominion and ignored animal suffering. So utilitarianism is the better option because pain matters no matter the species. Sounds noble until you actually open the hood on utilitarian ethics. First, just as with the prior LGBTQIA plus issue, utilitarianism is just as vulnerable on animal cruelty as Christianity because it only counts suffering when it tips the math in the right direction. If animal testing, factory farming, or habitat destruction brings greater overall happiness for humans, utilitarianism not only allows it, it demands it. The cows suffer so the spreadsheet can smile. Second, it's inferior in at least 3 other ways. 1. No baseline principles. Animals have value only if their pain registers high enough on the happiness pain scale. That's not ethics, that's emotional accounting. 2. It justifies atrocity by arithmetic. If torturing 10 animals cures cancer, utilitarianism calls it moral. If torturing 100 humans did the same, it would be 2. The math doesn't care. 3. There's no room for intrinsic worth. Animals, people, ecosystems, everything is a variable in the pleasure-pain equation. Nothing has rights, dignity, or sacredness, just utility. So no, Craig, Christianity gives us human dominion, but utilitarianism gives you dominion too, just with a calculator and fewer rules about what you can do with it.
Divorce. Well, Jesus condemns it, trapping women in abusive marriages. What's the alternative? Humanist ethics. If your ethics lock women with abusers, then they're not the best ethics, they're barbaric.
Craig says Christian ethics trap women in abusive marriages because Jesus condemned divorce, so let's just switch to humanist ethics where freedom reigns. Really? Humanism again? Alright. First, humanist ethics is just as vulnerable as Christianity on the problem of abusive marriages because it has no principled boundary on what counts as marriage, commitment, or obligation in the first place. If marriage itself is defined as nothing deeper than mutual consent, then the moment it gets hard, humanism turns ethics into speed dating with paperwork. Second, it's inferior in at least 3 other ways that I haven't mentioned already. 1. Moral subjectivity. Humanism grounds everything in human well-being, but can't define well-being in any consistent or objective way. One person's liberation is another person's betrayal. 2. Majority mood swings. Humanist ethics shifts with culture. A century ago, divorce was scandalous. Today, it's casual. Tomorrow, who knows? Morality by social fashion isn't a foundation, it's a weather report. 3. 0 transcendent safeguards. If morality depends entirely on collective opinion, then even abusive marriages can be normalized again if the culture decides to call it family values. So yes, Christian ethics can be rigid, but humanist ethics doesn't solve the problem. It just hands out moral hall passes with no expiration date, though it may be confiscated.
Truth versus faith. Faith equals belief without evidence. What's the alternative to that? Well, just rational ethics. Because believing without evidence isn't ethical strength, it's simply gullibility.
Craig says faith is just believing without evidence. So let's replace it with rational ethics. Logic, reason, no blind leaps. Sounds alright? Until you actually read the fine print. First, rational ethics is just as vulnerable as Christian on belief without evidence because rationalism itself rests on improvable axioms. Logic, mathematics, even the laws of physics, all taken on faith at the starting line. You can't prove reason by reason without going in a circle big enough to make NASCAR jealous. Second, it's inferior in at least 3 other ways. 1. Moral coldness. Rational ethics can justify brutally efficient systems with zero compassion. Think eugenics programs designed for optimal outcomes. 2. Exclusion on the non-rational. Children, the disabled, the elderly with dementia. If rationality defines moral worth, these groups get shoved into the margins first. And fast. 3. Historical failure rate. Purely rational systems, from the French Revolution's cult of reason to Marxist materialism, produce body counts that made the Inquisition look like a weekend hobby. So yes, faith can be abused, but rational ethics alone, that's just moral math homework rated in blood.
Inconsistency across denominations. There are 40,000 plus sects that can't even agree on your own set of Christian ethics. Well, what's the alternative to that? Universal principles of reason and compassion. Because if Christian ethics were really the best, Christians wouldn't need 40,000 different versions of them.
Craig points to 40,000 Christian denominations as proof that Christianity can't be the best system, because apparently moral truth depends on everyone holding hands and singing Kumbaya. His solution? Universal principles of reason and compassion. One big, happy, ethical family. Isn't that nice? First, universal reason and compassion ethics is just as vulnerable to fragmentation as Christianity, because reason and compassion don't agree with each other half of the time anyway. Reason says one thing, compassion screams another, and suddenly you've got 40,000 secular splinter groups voting on whether logic or feelings get the final say. Second, it's inferior for at least 3 other ways. 1. Compassion creep. Compassion with no limits excuses criminals in the name of kindness while abandoning victims in the name of understanding. 2. Reason's blind spots. Reason alone can justify cold, utilitarian nightmares. Think forced sterilization or population control because the math worked out on paper. 3. No unifying foundation. Universal principles collapse the moment two cultures define compassion or rationality differently. Congratulations, Craig. You just invented 40,000 secular denominations with fancier vocabulary. So yes, Christians disagree, but universal reason and compassion ethics, it disagrees with itself before breakfast.
So my opponent tonight will need to do more than just say Christianity has some nice ideas, because it also has slavery, misogyny, homophobia, blind obedience, and genocide baked in. If I can point to any alternative that does better in any of these cases, and I've just given you 13, then Christianity is not the best. And if he still insists it is, I've got one last example. The Federation, with its replicators, warp drives, and universal equality. Compared to that, Christianity looks about as modern and useful as Windows XP. Buggy, outdated, and no longer supported. Thanks very much.
Craig ends his opening statement with the Federation replicators, warp drives, and universal equality, as if science fiction utopias prove real-world ethics. Compared to Star Trek, he says Christianity is Windows XP, buggy, outdated, and no longer supported. It's a cute line, Craig, but let's unpack it. First, the Federation fantasy is just as vulnerable to moral failure as Christianity or anything else, because it exists in a story where the writers can delete evil with a keystroke. Real-world ethics don't get script rewrites when things fall apart. Second, it's inferior in at least 3 other ways. 1. There's no historical reality. Star Trek ethics exists in a vacuum where scarcity, human nature, and moral conflict conveniently disappear. Christianity, for all its flaws, was forged in a mess of real history, not a utopia fan fiction. 2. Ethics is on autopilot. Federation morality works because the universe gave it free energy, post-scarcity tech, and zero moral ambiguity. Take away the replicators and see how fast those principles survive famine. 3. Cultural imperialism. Even in Star Trek, the Federation forces its values on other worlds. Peacefully, sure, on occasion, until they refuse. Then the photon torpedoes come out. So no, Craig, Christianity isn't Windows XP. But the Federation, that's ethics running in safe mode with all the hard problems conveniently uninstalled.
I agree. Right. So what we're going to do is I'm going to right now create a brand new system of ethics that is way better than Christianity, which destroys your claim. It's called CARE, which stands for consent, agency, reduction of suffering, and evidence. And here's the axioms, non-negotiables. Consent and agency. Persons are ends, not tools. No coercion. Informed consent. Whatever decisions touch a person's body, time, or property. Harm principle. First duty is to reduce suffering and prevent foreseeable harm. Fairness and equal worth. No arbitrary hierarchies like sex, orientation, caste, etc. Truth and transparency. Honesty is a moral requirement. And falsifiability, which means that there is an inbuilt correction system. That destroys anything that ever could be based on Christianity, because that allows for everybody to thrive under every possible circumstance, and for the only important thing to be the care and lack of suffering of humanity. That you don't need anything about Christianity or religion or anything. Everything there could make humanity better than it ever is. And it self-corrects when there is things that are wrong. That's what falsifiability is about, okay? Moral rules are a testable hypothesis. There we go. I've just destroyed your claim that Christian ethics are best by coming up with a new one that beats Christian ethics.
Here, Craig unveils his magnum opus, the CARE, or CARE framework. Consent, agency, reduction of suffering, evidence. He thinks he's built the moral iPhone 15, while Christianity is a pair of cans connected by a string. But let's hold this shiny new system to the same standard as everything else. First, CARE is just as vulnerable to moral failure as Christianity because it smuggles in unproven assumptions at every point. Consent only works if people are fully informed, free of manipulation, and not coerced by circumstances, a condition almost never occurring in real life. Reduction of suffering collapses when two people's happiness conflict. Who wins? And evidence? That only tells you what is, not what ought to be. Even Craig's truth and transparency axiom falls apart the moment honesty causes more suffering than it prevents. His whole system saws off the branch it sits on. Second, it's inferior in several ways. 1. Ethical subjectivity. Consent, suffering, fairness, these hinge on cultural definitions. In some societies, child marriage is consensual. In others, it's abuse. CARE can't say who's right without borrowing moral assumptions from somewhere else. 2. Conflict paralysis. What happens when reducing suffering requires violating consent, or when truth-telling causes harm? CARE has no moral triage, just competing absolutes in a cage match. 3. Self-refuting falsifiability. Craig says moral rules are testable hypotheses. Fine. Test CARE in Stalin's Russia or Pol Pot's Cambodia. Both promise to reduce suffering, honor equality, and use evidence. The body count says otherwise. And because Craig's suggested moral framework is so innovatively bad, it earns a bonus fatal flaw, all its own. CARE has no hierarchy for its own pillars. When consent, agency, reduction of suffering, and evidence collide, there's no internal referee. He treats the 4 pillars as co-equal non-negotiables. That sounds nice on paper, but ethics lives in the real world where principles clash all the time. Consider consent versus reduction suffering. Suppose reducing suffering for the many requires violating the consent of the few. Which wins? Craig's framework gives no answer. Agency versus evidence. What if the evidence shows a person's free choice leads to catastrophic harm for others? Do we reject their agency or override it? No hierarchy equals no decision made. Truth versus the harm principle. What if telling the truth causes suffering? Do we lie to reduce harm or harm others to tell the truth? Craig doesn't say. Without a hierarchy, CARE is just 4 moral absolutes in a permanent bar fight, each shouting, "I'm non-negotiable," louder than the others until nothing gets decided. So no, Craig, your ethical framework doesn't destroy Christianity. At the end of the day, your framework isn't CARE, it's IDGAF.